Hello, sir. How are you?
Thank you very much, and thanks for having me on your series.
It is my honor and pleasure to have you here, and I'm really thankful that you spared time. I know you have a busy schedule. You are reading, you are writing, you are uh, busy with your library and things and research, especially, and still you spared some time to join us in this session. I'm really grateful and thankful.
My pleasure.
Sir, we would love to know about the beginning of your life story. Let's start from there. Introduce yourself with the beginning of your life story, where it started.
Okay, I was born in a small village in Czechoslovakia in 1936. Um, as you know, this was a bad time in Europe, and my whole family, except my parents and one uncle who left Europe before the war started, all of them were murdered by the Nazis. But my parents and myself were fortunate enough to survive because of various circumstances. And in 1949, we emigrated to Israel. I spent 1 year in a kibbutz to learn Hebrew, and in 1950, I joined a high school in the city of Haifa. It was considered a very good school, and it had a tremendous influence on my future life. Because there, in this high school in Haifa, I met a very charismatic teacher of Arabic, and I started studying Arabic in 1950. In 1950. Now, this charismatic teacher influenced me a great deal. He convinced me and he convinced many other students of his that Arabic is the most important subject in the world. And we devoted many times, as we say in good English, I burned the midnight oil in order to study Arabic. So I finished my high school, and in 1956, I joined as a student the Hebrew University. I studied in two departments, Department of Arabic Language and Literature and Department of Middle Eastern History. I should say something about the history of the Hebrew University because this interview is not only about me, but about my colleagues and about the way in which Islamic studies developed in this country. So the Hebrew University was established in 1918. This was the ceremony of the cornerstone stone laying, and it was opened in 1925. The first three departments of the Hebrew University were chemistry, Jewish studies, and Islamic studies. So we can say that this field of mine was a central field at the Hebrew University since the very beginning. So, as I said, I studied Arabic language and literature and Middle Eastern history, and I finished my MA with a thesis on a classical Arab poet from the 11th century called Abul Ala al-Ma'arri. This was a heretical poet who criticized a great deal of the conventional attitudes in his period, and he became very famous in Arabic literature, though he has not, he didn't have very much following because of his heretical views. But I have to say that despite his heretical views, he lived a long life, died at my age, more or less, 85. But one should say that, you see, what was possible in the 11th century was frowned upon in the 21st one, because in the 21st century, one of these radical groups in Islam, the Jabhat al-Nusra, occupied his birthplace, which is in northern Syria, a place called Ma'arrat al-Nu'man. And on the city square, there was a statue of this Abu Lala al-Ma'arri, the heretic, and it remained there. You know, he was one of the few people who left some impression on Islamic history and came from Ma'arrat al-Nu'man. So there was a statue of his in the city square. So when these people conquered Ma'arrat al-Nu'man, they cut off the head of the statue. So he was living, I mean, he was attacked in the 11th century for his heretical views, but nobody harmed him physically. But in the 21st, the head of the statue was cut off. In any case, in 1962, I finished my MA in Arabic language and literature, and I received a scholarship to go to McGill in order to specialize in the history of Islam in India. The reason for this was that the head of our institute in the early 1960s, whose name was Uri El-Haid, he was an Ottomanist, and he thought that our institute, who was at that time teaching only about the Arab world and Ottoman history, he thought that we should expand Islamic studies in order to include both the Indian subcontinent and Islam in Africa. And I received a scholarship to go to McGill in order to specialize in the history of Islam in India. Now, why did I choose McGill? Because the head of the institute at McGill in those days was Professor Wilfred Cantwell Smith. Wilfred Cantwell Smith was one of the first Western scholars who specialized in Indian Islam. He, for some time, he was teaching at the Foreman Christian College in Lahore, I believe, and he was the first person in the West, I think, who wrote a whole book about Indian Islam, which was called, the title was Modern Islam in India. Now, this was a rather revolutionary piece of research. It was rejected as a doctorate in London, but eventually it became a basic book for the study of Indian Islam in the West. So I studied with Wilfred Cantwell Smith for 1 year, because after my first year, he moved to Harvard, and I studied with other teachers. I studied there also Urdu with a gentleman who was born as Phil Barker, but he went to Pakistan and he met Maulana Maududi and he embraced Islam at the hands of Maulana Maududi, and he became a very strict, observant Muslim who was usually criticizing the Pakistani students who were there because they didn't observe the commandments very properly. So there were always some clashes between Phil Barker, who became Muhammad Abdurrahman Barker, and he was criticizing the Muslim students for their lack of observance. You see, he was a fundamentalist gentleman before fundamentalism became a very central idea in the Muslim world, to such an extent that he refused to accept interest on his bank account. Neither I knew nor he knew that according to the Hanafi school of law, it is permissible for a Muslim to engage in interest transactions in Dar el Harb. And if Canada in those days was Dar el Harb, so he could have accepted interest on his account. But in any case, he taught me Urdu. And I must say that he was a very good teacher, really very good teacher. I was his only student, and I had two teachers, this Muhammad Abdurrahman Barker and one Indian gentleman called Muhammad Shafi, who was, of course, a native speaker of Urdu. Yes, and this was the idea that you should have a linguist together with a native speaker, and this is how my classes went on. One student, two teachers, and we used to joke that two Muslims are teaching one Jew from a book prepared by Christian missionaries to convert Indian Muslims to Christianity. So this was
that's something very wonderful.
yes, it was very nice, and I should also say the following. You see, in the bylaws of the McGill Institute of Islamic Studies, there was a rule, and the rule said that if someone wants to have a PhD in Islamic studies, he must spend a year in the Islamic world. Now, the year was 1962. The whole Islamic world was closed for me. Yes. And it was logical because I specialized in the history of Islam in India. So it was logical that I go to India. So I submitted an application for a visa to the Indian consulate in Montreal. 1 month passes, 2 months pass, nothing happens, no word. And the reason was, of course, that the relations between Israel and India in those days were barely existent. There was a consulate in Mumbai, but there was no embassy, and the relations were quite tense. So the Indian consulate is silent, and here I need to bring in to my story a good friend of mine, not alive anymore, and his name was Mushirul Haq. Mushirul Haq studied with me. He was a PhD candidate together with me, and he was a graduate of Jamia Milia Islamiyah in New Delhi. And, you know, I used to practice my Urdu on him, and we were very good friends. And he explained to me the situation with my visa. He said, he called me Farid Mia. This is the nickname which I received from Mushirul Haq, Farid Mia. And he said, Farid Mia, you will never get a visa. If a Hindu gets your application, he will reject it because you are studying Islam. And if a Muslim gets your application, he will reject it because you are an Israeli. And if a Sikh receives your application, he will reject it because you are not a Sikh. So he knew what communalism means, this Mushirul Haq. So, you know, the time passes and the Indian consulate is silent. And then the head of the institute at McGill, he knew Zakir Hussain. Zakir Hussain was at that time the president of India. So they approached Zakir Hussain. In no time, I got my visa. What a wonderful thing, right? A visa with a presidential intervention. This is really wonderful. So in I have to say something about the future history of Mushirul Haq. Mushirul Haq returned to India after he finished his PhD. He first worked at the Jamia Milia in Delhi, but in the 1990s, he became the vice chancellor of Srinagar University in Kashmir. And one day he was kidnapped by one of these radical groups there and he was murdered. So this was the end of Mushirul Haq. I dedicated one of my articles to his memory. So in 1964, after I received my visa, I went for a study year at Aligarh University. In those days, it was called Aligarh Muslim University. But then the Muslim was taken out. There was a riot there, and there were many things. And eventually, the Muslim was taken off the name, together with Benares Hindu University. The Hindu was taken off the name as well. So I spent 1 year in Aligarh, and I have to speak about one person who was very helpful to me. He is also, he's not alive anymore, but his name was Sheikh Ahmad Nizami. He was professor at Aligarh, and he was specializing in the history of Sufism in India. He wrote about the Suhrawardi Tariqa and about the Chishti Tariqa in the 13th century, and he really almost adopted me during that year. He opened his library for me, and it was very, very important. If we want to speak about my Sirhindi book, this changed the Sirhindi book completely. He had a wonderful collection of manuscripts, which he opened for me, and it changed my dissertation very substantially. So I spent the year at Aligarh. I continued there with my research on Sirhindi, and at the end of the year, I returned to McGill for my last year of the doctorate, and I wrote up the dissertation. And in 1966, I returned to Israel and I started teaching at the Hebrew University. Now, in the first about 20 years, between 1966 almost until 1990, I worked mostly on various topics on Indian Muslim thought. I published the book on Ahmad Sirhindi, and I published another book on Indian Muslim matters, which is the book called Prophecy Continuous on the Ahmadi movement. Now, I have to tell something again about the departments at the Hebrew University. As I told you, the first three departments of the Hebrew University were chemistry, Jewish studies, and Islamic studies. This was always a central issue at the Hebrew University, and there are very many students in the field. About 20% of them are Arab students. And this is really a going concern, this field at the Hebrew University. My teacher from the high school, whom I mentioned at the beginning, moved to the university in the 1960s. And his name was Meir Kister, a Polish gentleman who was in love with Arabic and especially with the prophetic hadith. You couldn't speak to him about anything except the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. This is what he wanted to talk about. And he introduced the study of hadith in a very extensive way. This was his real contribution to our curriculum, and he was very successful in this. He also established a journal. Is it seen? Jerusalem Studies in Arabic and Islam. We now have 48 volumes of this. The first volume was published in 1980. So again, we consider this some kind of a flagship of our department. So I was teaching at the Hebrew University, and I could say a few things about some very special, things which happened to me during all these years. It is to teach, for an Israeli scholar to teach Islam is not like to teach anything else, because there is always the question whether you can be objective, whether politics influence your scholarship, etc., etc. And many times it happened to me that I was asked very strange questions. I was once in a conference in Zagreb, and I was told that only Muslims should speak about Islam and certainly not Israelis. I taught 1 year in the States, and somebody invited me for coffee and said, "This is not PC. This is not politically correct that you teach about Islam." I told him, PC is a personal computer. This I can accept, but on all other things, I think the teaching about Islam is not depending on birth or on religious conversion, but on study and research. So many such things happen to me. I should perhaps speak about another event which was I thought it was an important event. In 2008, I was invited to give 2 lectures at the Jamia Milia Islamiyah. And the vice chancellor in those days was Mushirul Hassan, of blessed memory now. But he invited me to give 2 lectures. It was very nice. Plenty of hundreds of students came to listen. I lectured about tolerance and coercion in Islam and about the messianic idea in Sunni thought, and I enjoyed it. I really enjoyed it very much. Among other things which happened to me, which are very specific to an Israeli scholar of Islamic studies, in a conference in Spain, at breakfast, I saw a table with a couple there, and I thought there was a place, and I asked permission to join them. And there, the person who was sitting there, I don't know whether you heard the name, Nasser Hamid Abu Zaid. You heard, but probably not. You know, he was professor of Arabic in Cairo. And when he was up for promotion, to full professor, there was a committee, of course, to check on his credentials and so on. And the committee rejected the promotion proposal. It rejected it because the gentleman in one of his books said that the Quran is a historical document which developed during 22 years. Now, this is a terrible thing from the point of orthodox thinking to say such a thing, because the Quran, according to common theology, is qadim, which means it existed even before creation. And here comes a Muslim Arab scholar who says that it developed during the prophetic career of the prophet. Yes. So not only was the promotion rejected, but his wife was required to leave him because he is now an apostate, a murtad.
Oh,
So they had to leave Egypt, and the gentleman received a position in Leiden. And then he returned to Egypt, and he died by a virus, not because of any harm done to him, but this is what happened. And during that breakfast, we had some discussion, and his wife was a scholar. She still is, I think. She is alive, a scholar, cultural studies, and she did her doctorate on the Spanish Civil War. And when she saw my badge with the Hebrew University, she immediately asked me at breakfast, even before the first coffee, whether I was in a concentration camp. So here I am at breakfast giving her some details about that. And then I asked her, why do you ask me at breakfast before the first coffee whether I was in a concentration camp? So she said, I am teaching about the Holocaust in Egypt. And here was an informant. So if you want to pose a question now, and
no, no.
then we'll.
Yasmin was saying hello to you.
Excuse me?
Yasmin was saying hello to you.
Oh, thank you very much. This is my daughter in Swansea. Yes, thank you very much, Yasmin. Okay. I planned, if it is agreeable to you, to speak
Yeah.
about one or two subjects in my research.
Yeah, please, please.
Okay.
We would love
So
to hear about it.
the first subject which I chose is the controversy um, between two ideologies which were among Indian Muslims in the 1930s and 1940s. And this is the controversy between Muttahida Qawmiyat and Do Qawmi Nazariya. So I will start with the Do Qawmi Nazariya, which is the ideology of the Muslim League. And as the audience probably knows, this was an ideology which eventually resulted in the establishment of Pakistan. The person who was the main speaker or the main developer of this ideology was, of course, Muhammad Ali Jinnah. And he opined that Hindus and Muslims belong to two different nations. There is a gap between them, and the Indian Muslims should be considered a nation, and they have the right of self-determination, and they must establish a state of their own. Now, this was the ideology which eventually won the day, and Pakistan was, of course, established. But there was a competing ideology, and the competing ideology was developed by an organization called the Jamiatul Ulama Hind, an organization of the Indian ulama. And the main person who wrote about this ideology was a gentleman called Hussein Ahmad Madani. And I would like to explain a few things about the thought of Hussein Ahmad Madani. He was, of course, a Deobandi scholar, and he had a completely different idea about the nature of Indian Muslims, an idea completely different from the ideology of the Muslim League and of Muhammad Ali Jinnah. Now, this ideology approached the problem of Indian Muslims in a completely different way. And it said that Indian Muslims can be members of the Indian nation despite the religious differences between the various components of the Indian nation. And the idea was that nations, according to Hussein Ahmad Madani's view, are built on different bases. And I would like to acquaint you with a passage from Hussein Ahmad Madani. I hope you will understand my wonderful pronunciation of Urdu. And so it is only a few lines so that we get the feel of what Hussein Ahmad Madani and the Jamiatul Ulama Hind wanted to achieve. जनाब गुलजार अहमद साहिब बसरा जिले शाहपुर पंजाब के नाम मुख्तरमुल मकाम जीदा मजदुकुम कौमें नस्ल मजहब वतन पेशोम वगैरह सबसे बनती हैं इसलिए इसमें मुनाफात नहीं है कि एक जमात किसी हैसियत से दूसरी जमात के हम कौम भी हो कुरान मजीद में अनबिया अलैहिस्सलाम और मुसलमानों को कुफार का हम कौम एक दो नहीं बल्कि 70-80 जगह करार दिया गया है इसलिए मुसलमान हिंद बहैसियत वतनियत जो यूरोपियन लिसान में मदार अलैहि नेशन का है दीगर अक़वाम हिंदिये के हम कौम हैं मगर बहैसियत मजहब मुग़ायर हैं बहैसियत नस्ल खुद मुसलमानों में बहुत सी कौमें होंगी जिनमें से मुतअद्दिद कौमें गैर मुस्लिम कौमों से भी नस्ली बिना पर मुत्तहिद हो जाएंगी जैसे राजपूत जाट वगैरह बहर हाल मुसलमान हम कौम बिरादरान वतन भी हैं और गैर भी. So this is the gist of the Muttahida Qawmiyat ideology, which means, in other words, that nations can be built on various bases. There is the basis of ethnicity, of religion, of homeland, of profession, and other matters. And there is no contradiction. In Hussein Ahmad Madani's view, there is no contradiction between these factors. One group can be in the same nation as another group on the basis of one factor. The prophets considered Muslims and unbelievers as belonging to the same nation, not in one or two places, but in 70 or 80 places. It means in 70 or 80 places in the Quran. Now, he does not explain which verses of the Quran he means, but his editor gives us an explanation. The issue is that the pre-Islamic prophets, some of whom appear in the Quran, prophets such as Shu'aib, Salih, Hud, these people uh, addressed their infidel communities by saying, Ya Qawmi, O my nation. So they apparently consider themselves, they were, of course, Muslims, because all prophets are Muslims even before the emergence of Islam in the 7th century. So they address their nations as my nation. So this means that they consider themselves being a part of the same nation, so co-nationals, hamkom, yes, co-nationals with other nations on the basis of common homeland, but they were, of course, religiously different. So, on the basis of ethnicity, among the Muslims themselves are many nations, and some are united with Muslims on an ethnic basis. Likewise, Rajputs, Jats, and others may be brothers of Muslims on the basis of homeland, but differ from them on the basis of other factors such as religion. Now, this is the gist of this ideology. But there were, of course, many other arguments in favor of opposing partition and having the Muslims part of the whole the Indian nation. For instance, Hussein Ahmad Madani always argued that if partition goes through, the the Muslims of India will become a much smaller minority than they would have been otherwise. As you know, there in the three countries of the subcontinent, there are about 25% Muslims. But after partition, only 14% of the Indian population are Muslims. And therefore, Madani argued that the Indian Muslims will have little influence, and this is not a good policy to proceed. So I studied all these subjects in the 70s, and I, of course, returned and read about it again for this interview. And I am now ready if you have a question, or how do you want to proceed now?
There is one more likeness from your family, I
Oh,
guess.
who is it? Oh,
Zafira.
yes, my wife. Yes. Okay,
She likes it. Definitely, she likes it.
good. Thank you. She's biased. She's
Yeah.
biased.
And sir, when we were discussing about this session, you mentioned that you would like to light a little about your research on 1940s Darul Islam and Darul Harab in the
Yes.
modern Indian Muslim thought.
Okay. Um, the issue is like that. When we look at the classical Islamic law, the classical jurisprudence used to divide the world into Dar al Islam and Dar al Harb. Dar al Islam is very easy to define. Dar al Islam is a place which is under a Muslim sovereign, a place where Islamic law is in force, a place where the Muslims and the dhimmis, the non-Muslims who receive protection, live in security and have freedom of religious observance. Dar al Harb is more difficult to define. It is usually explained as a place which is not under Muslim rule, and it is called Dar al Harb because eventually it has to be incorporated into Dar al-Islam by means of war, by means of jihad. Now, I must say that in the books of the classical jurisprudence, I have never seen such a definition. This does not mean, of course, that they didn't, that they opposed the definition. It may be that the thing was so well known that there is no, the definition is not necessary. But still, there is the question, how did the jurisprudence understand the term? In Arab dictionaries, it is sometimes said that this is a place which has no agreement with the Muslims, and therefore it is called Dar al-Harb. This is not a very good explanation because Harb, of course, is war, so why would one choose such a name? But this is the classical thing. What I want to contribute to this issue is a controversy which was in India in both in the second half of the 19th century and in the early 20th century. There were two groups in India which discussed the question whether India under the British rule is Dar al-Islam or Dar al-Harb. One group was a Bengali group called the Faraiziyah. And the Faraiziyah argued that India is Dar al-Harb, abode of war. Why is it abode of war? It is abode of war because India is under a non-Muslim sovereign, yes, the British Queen, and therefore it is not possible, according to the Faraiziyah, even to perform Friday prayer, because Friday prayer needs an imam and the khatib, and these imams and khatibs must be appointed by a legal Muslim ruler. Now, there is no legal Muslim ruler, and therefore one cannot perform Juma prayer because there is no imam and no khatib. This was one view of the Faraiziyah. The other view, which was published in around 1870, about 1870, was also by a Bengali gentleman whose name was Karamat Ali Jaunpuri. I don't know why he's called Jaunpuri. He was a Bengali. Maybe he was born in Gujarat. I don't know. Yeah. In any case, he introduced a completely different idea on what is Dar al-Harb. And he argued that the main question when we discuss the issue of Dar al-Islam and Dar al-Harb is not the religious affiliation of the sovereign. It rather is his policy. And therefore, since the British Raj did not interfere in the performance of Muslim commandments, yes, the British Raj allowed the Muslims to perform prayer and so on, one does not have to consider India as Dar al-Harb. One can live a fully Islamic life under British rule because the main thing, the performance of commandments, is possible, and the issue is not the religious affiliation of the sovereign, but rather his policies. And it was a rather new approach to the definition of Dar al-Harb. There were some people in the Middle Ages who thought along similar lines. The most famous case is in 12th century Central Asia, when the Karachitai dynasty was not a Muslim dynasty, it was a non-Muslim dynasty, but it allowed religious freedom to the Muslims. And there is a book of law from that period, which I had the good fortune of finding in the British Library. And the first sentence in this book of law is felicitating these non-Muslim sovereigns of Central Asia, and يسعدهم في الدنيا والآخرة. Let them be fortunate in this world and in the next. I have never read such a greeting for a non-Muslim ruler in a Muslim book of law. But there were such things, and how to put it, the assumption of the classical jurisprudence is that if you live under a non-Muslim ruler, he will not allow freedom of religion. And probably this is influenced by by the experience of the early Muslims in Mecca before the Hijrah. There was no religious freedom for the Muslims there. The city was still under non-Muslim rule, and they suffered a great deal. So this entered into Muslim jurisprudence as a principle, but it was not always so. Yes, it was not always so. And in the 12th century, Central Asia, and then in India, it was given an ideological foundation that there are cases where the sovereign is not a Muslim, he allows freedom of religion, and therefore the place is not Dar al-Harb. So these were the two subjects which I wanted to speak about today. Is there anything else that you would like to ask, or?
No, thank you, sir. I'm very grateful and thank you for your time. And meanwhile, your old friend, Dr. Khalid Mahmood, he was watching this interview on some social media.
Really?
Uh, yeah, and he liked. So he passed his likeness for this session, and I
Good.
hope one day we will be able to gather you both, old friends, old class fellows of McGill.
McGill
Uh,
Mafia. McGill
McGill Mafia.
Mafia, he calls it.
So, and I am really thankful for your time and hope to see you very soon again. Uh, People like you are like in a session, we cannot get everything from you. We must have more and more sessions uh, with your comfort, and I hope to see you soon, sir.
Okay, thanks for having me, and all the best. All the best to you and yours. Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir. Thank you.
Bye.
Thanks.